Consciousness and Experience by F. H. Bradley. Footnote. These pages were first published in Mind for April 1893. It is with some hesitation that I have resolved to reprint them, but it seemed to me clear that, if republished, they should be left unaltered. Whether Professor Ward has anywhere since the above date discussed the points raised in this paper, I regret to be unable to inform the reader. In his interesting and valuable work, The Realm of Ends, lately published, he appears to myself still to ignore a view which, if it stands, tends to unsettle the foundation of his main theories. For his article, see Mind, New Series, number 5. End footnote. The idea of writing a few remarks on this head was suggested to me by Mr. Ward's article on modern psychology. These remarks are not intended as a contribution to the subject, and certainly not as a hostile criticism. We must all feel grateful to Mr. Ward for his interesting discussion, and for myself, I feel sympathy with its general drift. And, as Mr. Ward has not yet worked out his positive view as to the subject, it would seem absurd in me to offer to criticize that view beforehand. But what has struck me is that in the discussion assumptions are used which, if true, are very far from appearing self-evident. And though in his own mind doubtless Mr. Ward is prepared with a defense of them, I do not find that he has done anything to prepare the reader. Hence, I thought it might be well to call attention to some points which seem ignored, but which to my mind appear to be fundamental. The main assumption seems to be the identification of experience with consciousness. Now, if by consciousness we understand the being of an object or a subject, this assumption, I should say, is at least disputable. To my mind, consciousness is not coextensive with experience. It is not original, nor at any stage is it ever all-inclusive, and it is inconsistent with itself in such a way as to point to something higher. 1. On the inconsistency of consciousness, I can partly refer to Mr. Ward, but I must also state the case briefly in my own way. We have an object, a something given, and it is given to the subject. Is the subject given? No. For, if so, it would itself be an object. We seem, then, to have one term and a relation without a second term. But can there be a relation with one term? No. This appears to be self-contradictory, and, if we assert it, we must justify and defend our paradox. But, again, can a term be known only as a term of a relation or relations, while it is not in any respect known otherwise? No. Once more, this is impossible, and, in the end, unmeaning. Terms are never constituted entirely by a relation or relations. There is a quality always which is more than the relation, though it may not be independent of it. We may, of course, for certain purposes, abstract and use working fictions, as we do, for instance, in the case of atoms and ether. But, outside natural science, it is a serious error to mistake these useful fictions for realities, and anything like a point without a quality, in the end, seems to be unreal, and constitution by relations a misleading phrase. But, once more, can we have a relation, one term of which is contained in the experienced, and the other not? No, for a term which is not in some sense experienced seems nothing at all. If in itself falls outside of the experienced, then it appears to be unmeaning, and it cannot therefore be consistently said to exist. Or at least we must continue to hold this until our difficulties are met. And they are not met by the mere repetition of those everyday distinctions, which we have been forced to set down as barely relative. And now, leaving the terms, consider the relation. Is there in the end such a thing as a relation which is merely between terms? Or, on the other hand, does not a relation imply an underlying unity and an inclusive whole? And then, once again, must not this whole be experienced or be nothing? Here are points, surely, which at least require some distinction. But consciousness must lead to self-consciousness, or possibly these difficulties are lessened. If the object is given to me, then I also must be given, and on reflection, I so find myself. I find myself given not in the abstract, but as concrete, experienced matter. Both terms are now objects, experienced with their relation, and the question is whether the difficulties are now less. We must reply in the negative. The correlated terms are for a subject, which is not itself given. The correlation falls in the experience of this new subject, which itself remains outside that object. And of the relation to this new subject, the old puzzles are true. This relation must have two terms more than their relation, and the more, again, must be experienced, or else be nothing. Any attempt to pass from within the experienced to that which in itself is not experienced seems quite suicidal. The distinction between the experienced and the experience seems, in the end, totally inadmissible, and the infinite regress is but an actual, unremoved contradiction. It is itself an absolute irrational limit. 2. The form of consciousness thus seems in hopeless contradiction with itself. But is it necessary to identify experience and consciousness? Here is a question which seems worth some consideration. Now, consciousness to my mind is not original. What comes first in each of us is rather feeling, a state as yet without either an object or subject. Feeling here naturally does not mean mere pleasure and pain, and indeed the idea that these aspects are our fundamental substance has never seemed, to me at least, worth discussing. I have ventured to consider it an absurd perversion of the older view. Feeling is immediate experience without distinction or relation in itself. It is a unity, complex, but without relations. And there is here no difference between the state and its content, since, in a word, the experienced and the experience are one. And a distinction between cognition and other aspects of our nature is not yet developed. Feeling is not one differentiated aspect, but it holds all aspects in one. And, though a view of this kind naturally calls for explanation and is open to objection, I am forced to doubt the wisdom of ignoring it wholly. For if it is difficult, it seems hardly so difficult as to take, for instance, our inward conesthesia as throughout our object, and a reference to Volkmann's book would show that it owns more or less the endorsement of well-known names. But if it is not false, then the identification of consciousness and experience is a wrong assumption. 3. But consciousness at all events, it may be urged, at a certain stage exists. Doubtless, but feeling on this account does not wholly cease to exist, and the experienced is therefore always more than objects together with pain and pleasure. Everything experienced is on one side felt, and the experienced is, also in part, still no more than felt. I fully admit here the need for explanation and defense. Footnote. One point to be noticed is that the products of relation and distinction apparently come to be experienced without their process. In this way, relational complexes may be experienced immediately, and, in a secondary sense, felt. Such felt masses can be attached to the object of consciousness, but to a far larger extent, they qualify the background. See page 177 of Essays on Truth and Reality. End footnote. But I cannot admit that such a view deserves to be ignored. The real subject, we may say, is always felt. It can never become wholly an object, and it never, at any time and in any case, ceases to be felt. And on this felt background depends the unity and continuity of our lives. lost hopelessly by associationism, and lost no less hopelessly by the identification of experience with consciousness. Our personal sameness consists in the ideal identity and the continuity of the experienced. Nothing more is wanted, and anything more, if it were possible, would, at least so far as we're concerned, be nothing. Nothing more is wanted, and anything more, if it were possible, would, at least so far as we are concerned, be nothing. And the opposite of this, I venture again to urge, should not be assumed as self-evident. For, in dealing with the puzzles of consciousness and self-consciousness, the difference brings important consequences. Those puzzles consisted in the internal difficulties of the relation and its terms, and then again in the fact of the relation itself. An experienced relation seems to involve an experienced whole, but this whole is at once supplied by feeling. For consciousness is superinduced on, and is still supported by, feeling, and feeling is itself an experienced whole. And the difficulty of the relation and its terms might from the sense basis be dealt with, though, naturally, I cannot attempt to work this out here. I will, however, try briefly to point out where the solution lies. There is a doubt, first, whether consciousness must imply self-consciousness. Can there, in other words, be an object unless that object bears the character of a not myself? In this latter case, the object itself will be part of the whole object, for it will be given as one term in relation with another given term. This question, to some slight extent, perhaps, is one of language, but for our present purpose, it may be left unanswered wholly. The solution of the problem, in any case, remains the same, and that solution lies in the fact that between the felt subject and the object, there is no relation at all. Whether the object contains or does not contain a self and a not-self in connection, on either view, there is still a real felt subject. And the object qualifies this subject, but there is emphatically no experience of a relation between them. And when by reflection a relation seems given, the experience has been changed. That relation is now part of a new object, and with that new object we have a felt subject, with which it is experienced, but to which it is not related. The above statement, I am well aware, calls for much explanation, but the only proper explanation would be a full treatment of the matter. What an object is, and how it differs from the rest of the experienced, how a content becomes an object, and how the transition is made from feeling to consciousness, these are problems which, in a small space, could not be dealt with. But, assuming an object in the sense of a something for me, I will say a few words on this preposition. The word for, without doubt, asserts a relation, and in addition, it asserts a relation in space. And, if so, clearly in language, I contradict myself when I deny that the object implies a spatial or any relation. And if all metaphors are to be pressed, then I, and I think all of us, in the end, must keep silence. But the question surely is whether such a contradiction is more than formal. And the question is whether on some matters, in order to speak accurately, one has not to use metaphors which conflict with and correct each other. Believing this to be the case, I repeat that the felt subject, in and for which the object exists, is not related to it, and yet is experienced with it. The object in self-consciousness, for it is better to take that stage at once, is two concrete terms in relation with each other. The whole of its contents and content is presented elements more or less qualified and extended by thought. What the content is on each side is not here my concern. My concern is to deny that this whole object is related to the subject, and yet to assert that it is there for the subject and present in it and to it, and that the subject itself is also experienced. The object content is no longer in unbroken unity with the felt whole. But this breach itself is not and cannot be an object. It can become an object for reflection, but in becoming one, it generates a new experience and a fresh felt subject. The subject always is felt, and neither itself nor its actual distinction from the object can be got out and placed before it as an object. And there is no distinction here between the experience and what is experienced. Footnote. For the outside observer, I may be asked, is there no distinction of this kind? Unquestionably, there is, but what it is a matter for discussion. If the observer takes the experiencing subject to be more than what is at one time experienced, taken together and in connection with its experience past, he may possibly be right. But I must remind him that if he assumes this, he is not arguing against anyone. He is merely assuming, without argument, that he is unquestionably right, and we are certainly wrong. End footnote. This view, briefly, and, I must confess, obscurely indicated, does not, of course, remove all difficulties. The difficulties it leaves are, I believe, not more than difficult. The elements we must deal with are, at any rate, contained in one world, while to make a passage in any sense from one to another will remain, I venture to think, entirely impossible. And this view, again, is surely not prima facie absurd. It is hard for one who, like myself, learnt and tried to teach it now many years ago, to judge on this point. But I would appeal to the reader. Take such an experience as ordinary desire. Besides pleasure and pain, we have in the state, I presume, a relation of something that is to an idea in me. These terms we may certainly agree to call objects, and, in some cases, in one sense, we may agree also to say this of the relation between them. But beside the above, is there nothing experienced in desire? I should say, yes. The whole experience is felt as one, and in that unity there is a background which is not an object. Desire, for me, is a felt whole, containing terms and a relation, and pleasure and pain, but it contains beside an indefinite mass of the felt, to call which an object strikes my mind as even ludicrous. And I would ask the reader if this view is so irrational that it may safely be ignored, and that the opposite of it may, without any discussion, be assumed. And my purpose in writing is not, at present, to explain and justify this view, but to emphasize the fact that it exists. And I would venture on a respectful remonstrance against approaching these questions with undiscussed alternatives. I do not suggest that Mr. Ward is not familiar with all that I have set down, or that in his own mind he is not fully prepared to deal with and dispose of it. But his readers, I think, are left without information, and the consequences, if so, must be injurious to the study of philosophy. When, for example, Mr. Ward assumes, or appears to assume, of unity and continuity, that because they are not in separate presentations, they are in or come from a subject outside the experienced, he can hardly realize the nature of the shock he administers. For unity and continuity, many of us have learned, are always ideal. They consist wholly in content, or else they are nothing. And they come from content, or else they do not come at all. And any assertion of the opposite, we are ready to contend, is inconsistent with itself. We may be mistaken, doubtless, in all this, and Mr. Ward doubtless is prepared to show us how our positive doctrine is wrong, and our negative criticism mistaken. And when he produces, as I hope he soon will produce, his doctrine about the subject and its true connection with the change and sequence of phenomena, I trust he will take some account of our errors. I do not know what his doctrine will be, but it could hardly lose in clearness if it were defined against such a criticism as, I presume, Hegel would have launched against it. And I do not say this for myself, who claim no right to assistance, and whose mind is, I suppose, presumably ossified. But with regard to the younger men, some of whom are growing up more or less in the same general view, the case is different, and they will hardly be helped by a tacit assumption that their conclusions, positive and negative, are not worth discussing. As for the associationist, If he is not confuted, he surely never will be. And I am sure that, however much confuted, he will never be convinced. Our business is, I suppose, not to be troubled about that, but to try to gain a positive result, which on all sides will bear criticism. And is it not almost time to say, let the dead bury their dead? But whether in metaphysics or in psychology, perhaps I hold the associationist far cheaper and differ from him more radically than Mr. Ward would think justifiable. For, in principle, Mr. Ward, I should say, has not broken with associationism. The question of principle, to my mind, is but the nature of the universal in being and knowledge. But with that question, Mr. Ward, as soon as he makes a serious attempt to work out his view of the identical subject, will have to deal. Then I may find that these well-meant remarks have been superfluous, since any truth they may contain has been included and provided for. I offer them notwithstanding, in the meantime, not as hostile criticism, nor yet as positive doctrine, for I admit that there are difficulties attaching to the problem, which I cannot at present, to my mind, altogether remove. But I offer the above as some considerations, which ought not in any case, and by any view, to be quite ignored.